everyone, D3PX here. Welcome back to this channel. Today I got a tier list of video game consoles. Not every video game console ever. I'm mainly focusing on who I consider to be the big five. So obviously you got Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, and then throughout history. I mean like the big five throughout history. So I'm throwing in consoles from Sega and Atari as well. Let's just get into this. The Atari 2600. Now, with this one, it's... Look, play the Atari 2600 today, and you have, like, no reason to do that, you know? None of these games have really held up all that well, but back in the day, it was a big deal. Atari... The 2600 wasn't the first console in the world, but, like... It was, like, the first one to actually, like, make a... I don't know what the fuck I'm saying. It was the first one to be a big deal. It was first, like, you have the Magnavox Odyssey, but that just played Pong. This played, like, multiple different games. Again, it hasn't held up the best, but it's Atari. We can give it some slack. You know, for its cultural significance, I'm gonna give it an A. Just because, it's Atari. It's Atari 2600. The 5200, though, was the... This was the follow-up to the 2600, but failed spectacularly. Because it was, like, huge. Like, the actual size of the physical console was just way too big. It cost a lot of money, and the games were not good. Probably an F. This one sucks. The 7800, though, was... This one was... They took... Like, they killed the 5200, and then I think this was after the crash of 1983, you know, with E.T. and Pac-Man and all that. They brought, like, and Nintendo came back. Atari then also came back with the 7800, but it just didn't stand a chance against Nintendo. And this was also a different Atari, I should mention. Like, the Atari that, like, before the crash of the game industry, that Atari shut down, and then like a different Atari company formed. It's like this weird story, but and they made this one. I could be wrong, but like, it's good, I guess. Like, not too many people really talk about how bad it is, so it's not that bad. But like, at the same time, how many people you hear talk about the 7800 in general? The 7800 kind of just exists, so I'm gonna give it a C. So now we get to where Atari stops naming their consoles after numbers, and they start naming them after cats. So we got their handheld system, the Atari Lynx. Kind of like the 7800. I don't know anybody who has... I mean, honestly, I don't know anyone who has a Lynx. I don't think it's sold very well, but, like, also, I don't, like, hear anybody, like, I've never seen any YouTube videos or anything like that of people talking about their fond memories playing on the Atari Lynx, you know what I mean? Like, it's just it seems like just a little console that, came out, and that was it. It came out. I can't even tell you a single game that was on there. For now, I'm going to give it a C, but maybe even lower. It doesn't seem like an overly, like, offensive console, though. The Atari Jaguar, on the other hand... this one is an F tier. Like, this one kind of felt like it was dead on arrival. It was trying to compete with the PS1 and the N64 and the Saturn. We'll get to those in a bit later. And it was talking about how it was all like, oh, it was 64-bit. But then, you look at the games, they're not really 64-bit. They're, like, at most 32-bit. So, yeah, just not a good console at all. Y'all remember the Atari VCS? Or maybe by its slightly more recognizable name, the Atari Box. I feel like a lot of you guys might have just thought, oh, the Atari Box. Yeah, it was renamed to the Atari VCS, and it did come out at some point, but, like, I'm not even going to talk about it. It's an F tier. Alright, so now we're done with Atari. We're now at Nintendo. And we're going to start with the NES. Again, I talked about how the Atari 2600 is, like, culturally significant, but the NES is also culturally significant. Like, the crash in 1983 happened, the NES is what like, you know, Nintendo rose from the ashes with the NES. And, gaming might not be where it is today without it. Spawned a whole bunch of iconic franchises, like, you narrow it down to just Nintendo, like, you got Mario, Zelda, Metroid, but even, like, you go beyond just Nintendo, you got Mega Man, Castlevania, Ninja Gaiden, Contra, you know, some of those games might not be doing so well today, but they're iconic, I feel. So for now, I might change this later, but for now, I'm gonna give the NES an S. We got the Game Boy. The Game Boy was a phenomenon. Probably one of the longest lasting, like, consoles or handhelds, whatever you want to call it, ever. It's, you know, and it was a big deal, because portable gaming wasn't really a thing. I don't know if there's anything before this one. Some of the games are not the easiest to go back to. It also didn't have a backlight. You needed, like, a flashlight to be able to properly see the screen. But it was still a worldwide phenomenon, and by the time it was, like, kind of dying down, by the time it was, you know, on its way out, Pokemon came out, and it blew up even more, and it just kept selling. It's hard to go back to today, though, so I'm gonna give it an A, but still, don't let that deter it. The Game Boy Color, so I'm going in chronological order by company, you know, so the Game Boy Color should be next, but the Game Boy Color is a bit weird. You know, it's not really a successor, you know, this is meant to be more like, you know, what the new 3DS is to the 3DS. The Game Boy Color is supposed to be that for the Game Boy, but, like, first of all, it's in color, which is big enough, but second of all, it has a bunch of games that are exclusive to the Color, and you can't play them on the OG Game Boy. It's kind of a different thing, but also not really. It's weird. A C feels harsh, so I'm gonna give it a B, but really, it's just a part of the Game Boy. The Super Nintendo. Basically take the NES and just make it just infinitely better. The NES has its, I feel like the NES is more culturally significant than the SNES, but the SNES is just, there are just so many fantastic games that have held up really well. Super Mario World, you know, A Link to the Past, Super Castlevania 4, Super Metroid, Mega Man X, Street Fighter 2, even though that was originally an arcade game, but still, like, the Super Nintendo is an S tier without a shadow of a doubt. The Virtual Boy. Do I need to really talk about this one? The Nintendo 64. This is a tricky one because, like, there's a lot of good and a lot of fucking bad with this one. For one, it was revolutionary for its, you have 4-player couch co-op. Like, this, to my understanding, this was the first console to ever do that, to have, like 4 controllers, and, like, you don't need an adapter for it. Like, the NES had an adapter where you can add 2 more players, and I think the Super Nintendo did too, but, like, the N64 just had 4 controller ports. So that's really cool. And it has some of the most iconic games of all time. Super Mario 64, people are still speedrunning that game. Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is, like, considered by a lot of people, like, one of, if not the greatest game of all time. The thing is, I'm gonna say this, and it's gonna get some, like, I'm gonna get some flack for it, but it hasn't aged that well. Like, a lot of these games are just not fun to go back to. Like, Mario 64 is even that's a little rough around the edges today, but that's perfect. It's still worth going back to today. Ocarina of Time as well. GoldenEye, though, is, like, that one's just a little, it's not bad, I don't hate it. Like, a lot of people will tell you it's awful now, but, like, you can definitely play much better today, if you know what I mean. And also it has cartridges, which hurt the console a lot. So the third-party support also isn't that great, but I think there's a lot of good to the N64, but there's a lot holding it back. I feel bad putting it in C, so I'll put it in B for now. The Game Boy Advance feels like it's almost like a beefed up Game Boy, a beefed up NES, and its own thing all at the same time. Cause it's a Game Boy in the sense that it's a Game Boy, it's the Game Boy Advance. A beefed up NES though, because a lot of the games on the Game Boy Advance were ported from the NES. You got that like NES Classic series of games, and but also it's got some fantastic original games. Like the Minish Cap is a great game. You got the Battle Network, Mega Man Battle Network games. It has a lot of Pokemon games. Metroid Fusion is really cool. My favorite game on there is probably Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, which is pretty crazy that a Konami game, in my personal opinion, is the best game on a Nintendo system. It's not perfect. Like, it doesn't have like any. One thing I just realized actually, it doesn't have a fully like original Mario game. You know, like a mainline Mario game. It's got the Mario Advance series, but those are all remakes, and weirdly fucking titled. The Super Mario Advance 4, you know, the remake of Super Mario Bros. 3, is really damn good, but like, other than that, yeah, it doesn't really have anything wholly original for Mario. It doesn't have it has a bunch of Mario spin-offs that are original, but yeah, still a really good console. I don't think it's better than the Game Boy, but I think I'd put it behind it in A tier. The GameCube might just be one of the most underrated video game consoles of all time. It had a similar issue as the N64, in that, like, so the N64 didn't have cartridges, which hurt it in the long run because a lot of third parties did not want to make games for it. The GameCube had discs, but they were smaller and had less space on them. So like all these big games had to be split into 2 discs, or some games just ditched the Game Boy in general. Like the biggest games of that generation, like think like the Grand Theft Auto games, or like Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, or Kingdom Hearts. They all skipped the GameCube. But you look at the GameCube as a Nintendo console, and it might just be one of the best libraries of Nintendo games. And like, unlike the Nintendo 64, where there was just many like droughts, Nintendo kind of like upped their game. They put out some games that they normally wouldn't, like Geist and Eternal Darkness, you know, 2 M-rated games, you know, a horror game, and then a kind of forgettable game about ghosts. You got Super Smash Bros. Melee, which still has a thriving competitive scene. Metroid Prime has held up very well. Metroid Prime 2 is really good. Mario Sunshine, which gets a bad rap, but I think that game is really solid. You get Kirby Air Ride. It didn't really get a like a mainline Kirby game. I feel like that's the one franchise that didn't really get like a mainline game on the GameCube, but Kirby Air Ride is better than most of the mainline Kirby games anyways, in my personal opinion. You know, it's a really solid Nintendo. It's a really damn good Nintendo console. How good of a console is it overall though? I'm not sure when you compare it to all these. Like, for now, I might lower it later, but for now I'm gonna give it an A, just because of the library of Nintendo games at display is really damn good. The Nintendo DS. I have a soft spot for this one. This was the first, to my memory, the first console or game system that I really played. You know, I think I had the original Xbox before that, but I didn't play it that much before I got the DS. The DS was the first one that I really played a lot of. And I just had fond memories. Like, I feel like I maybe wouldn't be into gaming if it weren't for the DS. And yeah, some of the games are a little primitive now, maybe not the easiest to go back to, but like, I think like Mario Kart DS, for example, is the best Mario Kart game. The DS, personally, I'm gonna give that an S, because I have a soft spot for it. The Wii is another fantastic console. It appealed more towards the casuals. And this was like the first time where Nintendo's like, yeah, we're just gonna be doing our own little thing. We're not trying to compete with Xbox and PlayStation. You know, the GameCube really tried to compete with those, and it just couldn't. The Wii didn't. The Wii tried to compete with nobody. A lot of the games haven't aged that well. Not in like you know, they still, I'd say, look perfectly fine, and but they haven't aged well in the sense that, like, they have forced motion controls. Like, back then, like, it was like the whole gimmick of the console, so I think it was just accepted. But you try to go back to play some of those games now. Like, Skyward Sword is one that a lot of people don't like because of its forced motion controls, you know. So, and there's a reason why a decent chunk of Wii games got re-released on like the Switch or the 3DS or some on the Wii U, I think. But that's because, like, you know, you don't want those forced motion controls. But I don't mean to give everything an S tier, and I'm not gonna give everything an S tier. Maybe I'll move some of these around, but I think the Wii U, not the Wii U, we'll get to that, but the Wii is an S. The 3DS. This one's weird because I feel like people don't talk about the 3DS that much. Like, I hear a lot of people talk about the DS, but the 3DS was kind of just something that came out, and it was, like, popular. People had the 3DS. Like, I remember going to school and people were playing on their 3DSs. But, like, now, after it's been a while since it's, like, discontinued, I don't hear too many people talking about the DS. I do see some videos about, like, you know, looking back at the 3DS, because it did have some really good games on there. Like, it had a Smash Brothers game. A handheld portable Smash Brothers game was, like, something kind of groundbreaking at the time. It also had games like Fire Emblem Awakening. It had Tomodachi Life, two of my favorite games on the console. Maybe some of my favorite games ever. Kid Icarus Uprising, Super Mario 3D Land, A Link Between Worlds, all really great games. It's just I don't think it's held up in the sense that, like, people don't really talk about this one anymore. So I'm gonna give it a B. The Wii U. Look, the Wii U, we all know it failed. You know, it just wasn't it. It had an interesting gimmick with, you know, having a little portable, or not portable, but, like, having a little tablet, a little screen. But it suffered from similar issues that, like, the N64 and the GameCube had, where, like, third parties just did not want to make games for it. And because they didn't want to make games for a second screen. They didn't want to develop for a second screen. I remember it was a bit tough being a Nintendo fan, because it wasn't cool being a Nintendo fan back then, because you're playing on the Wii U, you know. The Wii U wasn't a cool console. I mean, it was a cool console, but it wasn't cool to play on the Wii U, if you know what I mean. And if it, like, I would give it the benefit of the doubt. Like, maybe I'd give it a C, but, like, since the Wii U has come out and the Switch has come out, a lot of the best games on the Wii U have not, like, they're on the Switch now. So you don't have much of a reason to go back to the Wii U, you know. I'm gonna give the Wii U a D. It had potential, but it just wasn't it. Last for Nintendo, we got the Nintendo Switch. As a piece of hardware, it is very flawed. You know, the Joy-Con drift is, like, that shit fucking sucks. Like, but the software and, like, all the games, this might be the best Nintendo console in terms of its lineup. You know, and I know a lot of people are gonna tell me, like, oh, these damn kids. Like, first of all, shut the fuck up, okay? I know what I'm talking about. But also, like, tell me what other Nintendo console has a lineup like this, you know? Sure, maybe, like, the NES and the SNES might have similar lineups, but are just not as strong just because they were earlier and they don't have the franchise that the Switch does. But, like, this takes games that would normally be on the console and games that would normally be on the handheld, and so now you have twice as much games. So I'm gonna give it an S, because I think it's an S. as again, a piece of hardware, it's a little iffy. You know, the Joy-Con drift is an issue. You know, if you want to charge the Switch in handheld mode, the charging port is on the bottom of the handheld, making it kind of awkward. And like the online infrastructure is very flawed. It need friend codes. Come on. But like, first of all, the concept of it is just so cool, being both a handheld and a home console. But like, the library of games puts it in S tier alone. Next up, the Sega console, starting with the Sega Master System. This one, fun fact, this one didn't sell that well here in North America, but it apparently sold very well in Brazil, to the point where I think they're still selling it and they're still supporting it in Brazil, which is insane. But like, I don't know, it's like a worse NES, a worse Genesis. Like, let's see, I have nothing to say about the Master System. Speaking of the Genesis though, this one's an S. Like, I personally think it might be just as good as the Super Nintendo in terms of like library and lineup, because like this, like Sonic, you know, obviously it has Sonic, but like it's hard to really remember all this. But the Sega Genesis had a whole bunch of franchise, like it established so many franchises like Shinobi, Streets of Rage, which is like a favorite of mine, Golden Axe, Gunstar Heroes, Toe Jam and Earl, Kid Chameleon. There's a lot on the Sega Genesis, and like technically it is very impressive for its time, and like a lot of the music from the games on there are fucking go crazy hard. It's an S tier, I think, for sure. The Game Gear, Sega's attempt to rival the Game Boy, and a failed attempt, because trying to rival the Game Boy was just not gonna work out for you back then. But the game, I don't have much of an opinion on the Game Gear. I'm gonna give it a D. The Sega CD, sure, it's not its own console, but like it has its own library of games and its own like set of issues, I guess. I'm gonna put it on here. I'm putting it down here as an F tier. Actually, I don't know if it's an F. No, I don't think it's an F. I think it's a D, because it does have some good games. Like Sonic CD, I'm willing. Well, even then, Sonic CD on the CD's not that good. It's like the Christian Whitehead version of Sonic CD is really good, but you know it. Snatcher is a really good game, but we'll get to the 32X in just a minute. But the CD at least feels somewhat like necessary, because the Genesis did not have CD support. This gave it CD support. So yeah, moving on to the 32X though, that's definitely an F tier, because why was this a thing? Why did Sega make another add-on for the Genesis? It's for 32-bit fucking graphics, but just make a whole new console. The Sega Saturn, by the way, was already on its way. You know, it was already like almost out. So like, why did we get the 32X? What was the point of this? And unlike the CD, like, there's nothing really good that was like it had Knuckles Chaotix, which is decent, but like other than that, I can't think of any like crazy. The Sega CD does suck though. I think I'm gonna put that down here. Yeah, I should probably lump these two together, but yeah, they both suck. The Sega Saturn. This is a console that was absolutely murdered by its launch. But pretty much, this is like one of the most fascinating blunders in gaming history that I just like to tell every time. Pretty much imagine you're saving up for the Nintendo Switch 2. You know, it's announced it's coming out in, we'll just say, March of 2025, right? you're saving up for that. You're really excited to play the Nintendo Switch 2. And it has all these games lined up. It's got, like, Mario Odyssey 2. It's got Legend of Zelda, Twilight Princess, Wind Waker HD 2-pack. It's got fucking F-Zero, a new F-Zero game. And it's got, like, some third parties. And then just imagine the Game Awards. You know, the Game Awards at 2024. Nintendo, like, let's say Doug Bowser goes on stage and says, guess what, everyone? That Nintendo console you're all saving up for, and for you developers, all the that Nintendo console that you were making games for, that you weren't ready to put them out until March of 2025, guess what? It's out now! That's what happened with the Saturn. That's what happened with the Sega Saturn. It was supposed to come out in, like, November of that year or something like that. But in June at, like, E3, Sega, like, just... they shadow dropped the console, basically. But many consumers were not ready to make the purchase. Any developers that were making games for it were not ready. Their games were not ready because they thought that it was gonna be, like... they were gonna launch with the console and it was gonna be out, like, later on in the year, and retailers were not ready to have a whole new fucking console in stock. So that's the launch, and that really, like, hurt the Saturn because nobody wanted to work with Sega. Even though the third-party support is on the Saturn is definitely better than the Nintendo 64, right? Like, a bunch of third-party games from that generation that ended up on the PS1 also ended up on the Saturn. But, like, the companies just lost trust in Sega with that. Because, like, that... it might sound cool, like, yo, the console's out already, but, like, you gotta think about it, and that, if you're saving up for that, like, let's just think about it as a consumer. You're saving up for that, and it comes out, the console comes out, and you're not ready to make the purchase, so you can't buy it. So now the launch does poorly because a lot of the people who are saving up for the launch are not able to buy it. I know I'm not talking about the console so much, but, like, it affected the console. Even if it had good games like Panzer Dragoon and Guardian Heroes is a hidden gem on there. Even if it had good games, though, like, the third-party support and just the botched launch kind of just made the console not sell very well, so they couldn't really keep it around that much longer. Like, and there was work on a new Sonic game for that, Sonic Extreme, but it infamously got canceled, and before they were able to get, like, a new Sonic game going and put it out on the console, the Saturn got discontinued. So I'm gonna have to give it a D. It had a lot of potential to be higher, but it's just, like, this is where a launch of a console like, it killed the Saturn, and by extension it kind of killed Sega from making consoles, because this next console, the Dreamcast, still felt the effects of the Saturn. But unlike the Dreamcast, unlike the Saturn, I think the Dreamcast was a very solid console. It was ahead of its time. You know, it had, like, the Sega Net, which was basically their version of, like, Xbox Live or PlayStation Network. And a lot of the games, I think, look very good today. There's a lot of, like, arcade games, like, games that came out on the arcade that are pretty much only available on the Dreamcast. And, like, games like Shenmue are, like, very technically impressive for a console from back then. But the thing is, just people were not, like, ready to trust Sega again. So Shenmue is actually a pretty big contributing factor as to why Sega dropped out of consoles, because, like, that game was, like, over budget, and the Sega Dreamcast was not selling, so the game came out and they couldn't make back the budget, so Sega's like, we can't do this anymore. I think the console itself, though, is really solid. Like, it has Shenmue. Sonic Adventure, I think, gets a bad rap, but that's really good. Skies of Arcadia. It has all the Capcom games. Like, Capcom was, like, the biggest supporter of the Dreamcast. I can't give it an A. I'm gonna give it a high B. Next up is the PS1. This was really good for its time, in that, like, I said that when the third-party games, they weren't on the N64, they're on the PS1. They were, and that made the PS1, like, kind of the console to get. Even though it was kind of flawed as a piece of hardware, it was kind of flawed. Like, I mentioned the Saturn was a failure, but on a technical aspect, the Saturn, I think, was more powerful than the PS1. Also, the PS1 has not held up very well, I feel. So, I'm gonna give it a B, but it does have its importance, but I feel like it's just been outdone by a lot of the other PlayStations. The PS2, I think, is an S tier, because it, like, I think it remains the best-selling console of all time. The Switch might be getting up there, but first of all, it had a disc drive, you know? Well, I mean, yeah, it had a disc drive. I mean, like, it had, like, a DVD, it had DVD functionality. So a lot of people bought it, like, as a DVD player. So that's why it did so well. That's also just a nice, like, at the time at least, that was a nice, just a nice feature to have. But on a technical aspect, the console's really good, even though if it's not as powerful as the Xbox or even the GameCube, it's a really good piece of hardware, and the games on there, goddamn. Shadow of the Colossus, Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy X. It's the PS2 is amazing. The PSP, this one is another console I feel like is very underrated. I am gonna give it a B tier though, but I think this one is very solid because it is like a portable PlayStation, you know? Like, it has, you can put discs in like a portable console, which made things a little rough, but it has some really good games, like Crisis Core, fantastic game on there. I don't have much to say about the PSP though, but I think it does have very strong library of games, for sure. The PS3 is a tricky one, because we're talking about how that console launched, and like a good chunk of the generation, the PS3 would have to be in like C tier, maybe even D, because of like the price at launch was insane. Like $600 for a PS3 at launch. That's 2006. Adjust that for inflation. That is like, you know, how much is that actually? That would be, so $600 from 2006 equals $935.20 in 2024. So nearly $1,000. And on top of that, it had like the cell processor, which a lot of companies, like, I guess it made the console cool on a technical aspect, but like, a lot of third-party companies just did not want to make games for it, or at least not right away. So like, you had the Xbox 360, which got like a bunch of the third-party games first, or if they didn't get it first, if the PS3 got the games at the same time, like the Xbox 360 version was better, and games that were exclusive to the PS3 maybe haven't aged the best, or they're stuck on that console, you know? Like, there are rumors now that Sony is figuring out PS3 emulation, and it took them a while, because it's just hard to, like, port games from that console. But it turned things around, and we got games like the whole Uncharted trilogy, and like The Last of Us, you know. So like the last few years of the PS3 saved it from being like very low. I'm not quite sure how high I can have it, but maybe at the top of B, if not low. I don't know about putting it below the GameCube actually, so I'm gonna say A. The PS Vita, this one's, I'm not too familiar with the PS Vita. It kind of just happened, and but my brother loves the PS Vita, so I asked him what he thinks about it, where he would put it, and he said like maybe C tier or B tier. And yeah, like the PS Vita, it came out, and it sort of just, it sort of just came out. That was it. Like, Sony didn't really support it that much. It is worth mentioning that most people today will buy a PS Vita because it's very easy to hack, but we're not factoring that in. So, other than that, if you, like, what are you playing on your PS Vita? You're playing, like, Uncharted Golden Abyss? That's really the only game I can think of that was on the PS Vita that might be worth playing now, that is not on anything else. So, it is a cool little system, but, I don't know, I feel like, if I put it in C tier, it's going to be in the same tier as the Atari 7800 and the Atari Lynx and the Sega Master System, and it's probably most certainly better than those. You can put them put it right above them. The PS4 is a really damn good console. I don't know about S, but it's definitely at least top of A. This was the generation where companies you start to notice games coming out unfinished a lot more often, and you know, DLC that started in the previous generation, but you really got a lot of it here, microtransactions and all that. But the PS4, I'll say when we get, I'll talk about this when we get to the Xbox One. The PS4 just it won that generation from the very start. And sure, you can talk about the lack of variety in the PS4 games. You know, it's a bunch of over-the-shoulder single-player games, but at the same time, they are damn good games. Uncharted 4, God of War, Spider-Man, Horizon, Ghost of Tsushima, not The Last of Us Part 2, not Death Stranding. We're not going to talk about those games. But Until Dawn is another great game. The PS4 has a great not launch lineup, but a great lineup of games. So yeah, I think definitely an A tier. And to round out PlayStation, we got the PS5. This one's still going, you know. But the problem with, I feel like this generation has kind of been a little disappointing. Just because it kind of feels like it's barely started, and we're 4 years in. You know what I mean? Visually, the PS5 looks the games on the PS5 look amazing visually. And to be honest, I don't have too many problems with the PS5. It's just more Sony, honestly, that has become kind of shitty. The PS5 does have a great, I feel like a lot of people like to pick things out and talk about, oh, this part isn't as good, this thing's not that good. I think we're getting a whole bunch of sequels, and I wish we were not getting so many sequels. We were getting more originals, but God of War Ragnarok, Spider-Man 2, Horizon Forbidden West, I think in many ways are just as good, if not better, than the first games, And Final Fantasy 16 is really good. Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, I think, is a goddamn masterpiece. And I know those aren't Sony games, but they are PS5 exclusives. They are, I guess, reasons why you'd buy a PS5. And Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is really good too. And yeah, it's just I'm a little worried about the future of the PS5, because it feels like Sony's in a bit of a lull, and it looks like they feel somewhat good about being in a lull. I'm gonna give the PS5, though, an A. Right now, I don't think it's as good as the PS4, but at the same time, it's not done yet. It could get better. But if we stay at this, if Sony, kind of keeps it at this lull period, and keeps putting out more games like Concord, it could end up lower. But if they... Well, let's see how it plays out. Finally, we got the Xbox consoles. Another very underrated console, I feel, is the original Xbox. This one, even, from the, generation, I hear people talk about the PS2. I even hear people talk about the GameCube. I don't hear anyone talk about the Xbox. But I think it was a pretty solid console. It didn't sell that well, but it sold well enough to where Xbox or Microsoft felt the Xbox brand has a future, and we can definitely do more. So yeah, but it had Halo, which was crazy. Halo was crazy good. That was that was the killer app for the Xbox. It had other games like Psychonauts and Dead or Alive, Knights of the Old Republic. But Halo was the system seller. That's basically what carried the Xbox. I'm gonna give it a B. The Xbox 360, on the other hand, I'm giving an S. Sure, maybe like the Kinect might bump it down a little bit. I think it's at the bottom of S. But like this was when this like during that generation, the Xbox 360 was the console. And it's funny because it was a very like flawed piece of hardware. Red Ring of Death, anyone? But you got the Halo games, you got the Gears of War games, you got the Mass Effect games. Like, people talk about how Xbox doesn't have any games, and there is truth to that when we get to the Xbox Series X and the Xbox One, but the 360 is the exception. This console is absolutely like, and it's fun to go back to. Like, I say the PS3 hasn't aged the best. The Xbox 360 though, I feel like has aged very well. The Xbox One, I don't think Xbox has ever really recovered from the Xbox One. Like, the way they announced that, they talked about it more like it was a TV device than it was a gaming console. And then the always online thing, the Kinect stuff, it was just like they never really recovered from this. And this is when they stopped putting out, like, this is where their launch lineup, not their launch lineup, this is where just their library of games was not that strong. So yeah, I'm gonna give it a D. The Xbox One's not it. Lastly, the Series X. This one is very tricky to rank. Just like the PS5, but even then, the Series X is not as good as the PS5. As a piece of hardware, the Series X is really good. Or I should say the Xbox Series, but the Series X in particular is really good. That's the one I have. Like, since it has a disc drive, it's backwards compatible with all Xbox consoles. Not every game, but still 4 different consoles, all like 4 different generations, all playable in one. That's pretty crazy. It's also very powerful. The best looking game on the market, I feel, is Hellblade 2, which is an Xbox Series X game. The thing is, it doesn't have games. That's the problem. Like, 2021, they got quite a few games that were also on Xbox One, but whatever. That was still, like, in the cross-gen, like, period. 2022, I remember, had, like, nothing. And then 2023... say what you want about the games in 2023, but we'll give it that we got games in there. We got Hi-Fi Rush, which was really good. But then they killed fucking Tango anyways. But then we got Redfall, which was a catastrophe. Then we got fucking Starfield, which I feel like people, there's some revisionist history with that, even though it came out less than a year ago. But Starfield, I don't think is a terrible game. But my god, Starfield's still just not it. You know, and it's just, now we got Hellblade 2, which, again, I don't think that's a bad game, but at the same time, it's like a $50 tech demo for a console that's been out for like 4 years. And the tech demo is a sequel to a very well-beloved game. So, yeah, like, right now with this, and then, like, the recent news of, Microsoft raising the prices to Game Pass, which is, like, the reason to buy a console, an Xbox, is for Game Pass. Now they're making it, like, worse. It's, like, I don't know, man. Like, I want to give it a, maybe it's just I'm drinking the Kool-Aid a bit. I'm gonna give it a B, because it is a very good piece of hardware. But, like, I feel like it really should be higher. But Microsoft ain't really, like, it doesn't look like they're trying that much. So that is my list. I've moved some things around, but that is the final list. What do you guys think about my list? This recording has gone on way too fucking long, so I'm gonna end it now. I was making sure my webcam wasn't blocking anything, but it's not. So yeah, bye guys!